Oh, I love doing this. We're going to have a chat. Now, Bob, you've somehow found yourself in the middle of this huge transformation that's underway in the nature of food. And I have a whole bunch of questions that I want to ask you. But before I do that, I know that you've got a few slides that will help us. Now, normally, my view is that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. But I saw these slides and they're enormously helpful. So Bob, could you just take a few minutes and run through that deck to explain what you're doing?
So thanks for having me here today. Don talked a lot about different use cases for blockchain. So how many people in the room feel like they could go home to their grandmother, if your grandmother was alive, and explain blockchain? Well, this is interesting because it's about the same percentages in most groups I talk to, and I would have thought with the technology bent that might be in the room that you'd be better at that. The other perspective is how many of you could explain what a supply chain is? Okay, so we got a higher percentage there. And then I think obviously all of us care to some degree about our food. Gen Z tends to care more about where it comes from, how it was sourced, and how it flowed than potentially some of us in older generations. But the point here we're going to go through is how large companies in the food ecosystem globally are thinking about how blockchain applies. So let me share that with you, and then we'll come back for some Q&A.
Yeah, go for it.
So if we go to the slide deck, please. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, I am in control. Okay, now I'm not in control.
The red button will take you back. Okay.
So there's a macro challenge. Everybody comes to work every day thinking about what you have to do. You work for companies that think about what they have to do, and we'll get to that in a second. On the global scale, there are macro challenges with our food supply chain, food and beverage supply chain. If you look to the left of the slide, there's a lot of paper out there. There are still, believe it or not, on the farm as somebody's harvesting their crop, there are a lot of papers and clipboards and things that are not automated. They're certainly not digital. The supply chain in food starts as goods, physical goods, move from step to step to step. And imagine a food supply chain that we can now apply a blockchain digital representation of that along the way, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And why is that important? At the macro level, 1 in 10 of you in this room will get some type of food poisoning, food sickness over the next year. Could be minor, it could be major. 400,000 people a year will die from a foodborne illness. So there are macro reasons for us to address the authenticity, the quality, and the traceability of our food. Our population is growing very rapidly, and our food supply is not. And one way to address that is reduce the waste in our global food supply. About 1/3 of all food that's grown doesn't make it to the consumer. Somewhere along the way, somebody has deemed that it's not good enough. And so it's not just the trace of the goods, it's the quality of the goods to increase the yield. And then you heard Don mention seafood. There have been some studies done around the labeling and packaging of seafood. Can you believe what it says? Can you believe where it came from? Can you believe what is said about the fish or the type of shrimp? This one survey in New York City said that 43% of all the packaging that was picked up had some type of misinformation on the labeling. So there's a distrust inherent in the food system. Part of that started many years ago. You think about farming and where our food came from. There's been a journey of adding antibiotics, adding preservatives over the last 70 years to make everything better, quote, better and more stable. And then particularly in this last 5 years to say, okay, maybe we need to take antibiotics out, maybe we take the pesticides out, maybe we take preservatives out. Well, when you do that, shelf life is affected, and quality is affected by temperature on more products than you can imagine. So this is actually a picture of a 1,000-acre farm in China that Golden State Foods come down with owns. We raise produce, and we also teach Chinese local farmers how to farm to Western standards. This produce will go to quick-serve restaurants in China, and also some products will go into Walmart stores in China. Think about, in your own case, you take a head of lettuce. A head of lettuce, if it is transported from the time it's cut all the way through to the point of sale, whether it be a quick-serve restaurant or a retail outlet, if that head of lettuce is maintained at 34 degrees Fahrenheit, it has twice the shelf life as a head of lettuce at 39 degrees shelf life. Temperature, it has twice the shelf life. So the sensitivity to temperature is huge. But it's not just the absolute temperature. There's a phenomena called thermocycling, where if you stay within the bands of what are acceptable, but you go up and down, you get a little warmer, a little colder, a little warmer, a little colder. Lettuce is a cellular structure. It's mostly water. So the cellular wall is expanding, contracting, expanding, contracting. So you're going to have a less crispy product if it thermocycled through the process. Think about that for all the different food categories and the impact that if you take preservatives, you take antibiotics, you change the fertilizer profile, you now have a food system that needs the attention of data in order to validate that we're all going to eat healthy things. So how do I come to this perspective? Just one slide on Golden State Foods. As Don mentioned, $7 billion in sales last year, private company, 75 years old, a supplier to all the major quick-serve restaurant brands in the world, as well as some convenience stores, as well as some retail package items. If you've been to a Tim Hortons, a Starbucks, a Chick-fil-A, a McDonald's, a Chipotle, any time in the last month, you've probably consumed one of our products. And then we have a distribution business that delivers full truckloads of everything that would go inside, say, for example, Starbucks in the US, pull up in the middle of the night and deliver everything. So we have an idea of how the flow of goods and the quality manufacturing of processing of food products goes. So that's the perspective we bring to the table. We started a journey a little over 3 years ago just to think about digital. Digital in most supply chains starts with what standards are you going to use? What are you going to call things so that when one person calls it out, the next computer system, the next point in the process recognizes what it is without some big translation table. So there's a standards body called GS1 that has a GS1 128 barcode that standardizes every physical location in the world. If you sign up to be a GS1 member, has a unique number, and every product has a unique number. So you're able to, using that GS128 standard, use a barcode that says it came from this facility, it passed to this facility, and it's this product number. Well, how do you turn that into value? Well, if you look at the left-hand side, major brands are using supply chains that go from farm all the way to consumer. But today's world is really driven around ERP systems, and the enterprise systems have a view of one up, one down. I can see what came into me, and I can see what shipped out. But I don't see over the ecosystem of my brand. I don't see over the multiple points in it. And why is that important? As you add data sets and data elements, it's like we're going to talk about temperature, it's more important that more people see that than the shelf life that today than it was in the past, when you had shelf-stable product that could sit on the shelf for 120, 180 days. You had a lot more flexibility. Today, a hamburger patty has to be consumed within 14 days of the time it's produced. If it takes 6 days to get a replenishment signal based on a perturbation in demand, you've chewed up a lot of time in order to get your replenishment cycle rebalanced. So our vision was, could we create somewhat of a closed loop using blockchain to connect the parties and provide visibility of useful information? You heard Don talk about food safety. The problem with food safety for blockchain is that it's like an insurance policy. Who's willing to pay for it and sit around and wait for a disaster to happen? You have to have use cases, and hopefully those of you that are building companies and looking for ways to, you have to think of ways that the companies and consumers can use this data and make economically viable business models out of it while also building an infrastructure for food safety and traceability. So in our quick use case, started 3 years ago. This was a pilot. It's now in production. We could have gone from the ranch on the left all the way to the consumer on the right, but that's a lot of hard work. And that's one of the other lessons here is you have grand ideas for ecosystems and blockchain connections, but pick the places where you can get started and go quickly. So in our case, we own a $75 million production facility that makes hamburger patties. We owned a distribution outlet that handled I think about 350 restaurants served out of it, and we had great relationships, so we picked 8 restaurants. So we took the GS1 standard I mentioned. We added one thing to this that may be foreign to the blockchain conversation, but if you want to track a case of goods through the supply chain, how do you know when you take a pallet of 90 cases and you send 10 to this restaurant and 15 to this restaurant? How do you know which 10 went to that restaurant, which 15 went to that restaurant, and what temperature they traveled in? The only way is if the case has a serialized identification. And so for this body of work, we put an RFID chip on it so a scanner could read as it left the truck, as it went into the cooler. And actually in the cooler, a tablet on the wall that said, you have 30 cases in the restaurant, 10 of them have plenty of shelf life. And by the way, these 2 only have 2 days of shelf life. You better use those up quickly. And it helped with rotation management and got a lot of people excited about the potential. So the pilot proved successful in that there were daily use cases. This just wasn't a big data validation. This was the closest you get to physical daily transactions of physical movement and represented in the blockchain and value user interfaces that drive participation. As mentioned, a lot of value. So the main point on this slide is down the left-hand side. You have to have an ROI, you have to have a payback. So in the food business, rotation matters, freight costs matter. I won't read through the whole list, but there's a lot of excess stock built up in the supply chain in order to make sure nobody runs out. Well, if you can have real-time visibility and a sense of how fresh the product is and where your risk points are, you're going to be able to drive potentially economic value to the supply chain. And there are estimates that this could be as much as 0.5% to a full percent cost of goods sale of savings that if you had this kind of end-to-end visibility in your supply chain, you could drive. We started this journey 3 years ago, and we were one of the founding advisory members on IBM's Food Trust platform. So Walmart CEO Doug McMillon really kicked this off with IBM and said, we need as many companies involved as possible. He called a couple of his CEO buddies, even though they were competitors, and said, all boats rise with a rising tide, and we need to get the food ecosystem in a better place. So 8 or 9 of us, I think it was 9, and one company said they weren't quite ready yet, and we're down to 8 now. We've added 2 more. So there's about 11 or 12 companies now that form an advisory council that is the governing body over this. Your data is your data as a brand. The rules of engagement are clear, but there's always things that come up. One of which is, well, how are you going to be interoperable? Well, nobody's quite figured that out yet, but Hyperledger to Hyperledger, there's probably a pretty easy path to be interoperable, particularly if everybody's using a GS1 standard in the food industry. But then how do you evolve into somebody comes up with an Ethereum model they get from the farm to the processor, and then they want to connect back to the restaurant or to the supply chain. All those things will be figured out, but the advisory council is designed to meet and work through the issues and provide guidance to the technical teams at IBM. In terms of adoption, it's in production. There's over 200 companies on the platform. It's a private permissioned blockchain. So nobody can join without permission. Brands can give permission to their supply chain members, but there's a record of who was permissioned onto the system. And by the way, this is not going to require all the power consumption in the world to run. In a private permission blockchain, if it's in the Hyperledger architecture, there are ways to create what are called channels that allow for the parsing of the transaction flows so that consensus and even smart contract can be exercised on a subset of the nodes. So you don't have to have millions of computers, hundreds of computers. In fact, we envision there'll probably be 20-some nodes around the world, and that the European nodes may not have to clear transactions back to the North American nodes, et cetera. There's ways to deal with the transaction volume, and there's ways to get the same kind of trust without as much public, I need to have absolute global, every computer knowing my data or having a copy of my data. That's not going to happen. So 17,000 products, major retailers on it, more major retailers joining. Very exciting journey. I just want to end with a couple thoughts here before we go to Q&A. I talked about, could you explain blockchain to your grandmother? And I have been, in my business career, always tried to take technology and find ways to have a simple, clear picture that somebody could say, I can see that picture. It's a mental map, a mental image. So what I'd like to do now this is for blockchain, for private permissioned ecosystems. Think of the global ATM network. You go to any ATM machine practically in the world. If you have your card and your PIN number, you can do a private, trusted transaction. Bank of America has their application stack on top of it. Societe Generale has their application stack. Citibank has their application stack. But fundamentally, at the layer that matters for getting your money, that's a trusted global transaction platform. Now imagine that, just flip it, and imagine that for food. Any food transaction in the world can post, private permission post onto the platform, connect to the next leg in the journey, and become part of the supply chain blockchain journey for that particular product, supporting the customers that need that product. And so the customers needing that product, the other advantage they get is imagine an umbrella over your supply chain from the farmer all the way to either your retail location or ultimately even to your consumer. Stitching together the old legacy ERP systems and saying, I got to keep all that in sync is a very daunting challenge, particularly when you cross multiple parties, different brands, different suppliers. It's better to capture those transactions at the date time they occur and keep them visible and traceable and usable from the stitching together of them rather than ERP system up, data load down, matching. It's very complicated. So that real-time umbrella of data is also important. Probably the thing that is most important, my role at Golden State Foods is strategy and innovation. The strategy piece here is to look around the corner and see what's coming. And what hasn't been talked about a lot, but I think is the ultimate value creator for blockchain, is when you connect IoT digital data into your blockchain transaction stream. Why is that? You take the human out, because humans can put bad data into the blockchain, and it's just immutable. You can't change it without a change control process. Increase the fidelity of that data with computer device input. The world is going to become digital. You've got temperature data. You've got water quality data. What about the day 3 years from now, 5 years from now, where whether a farm is organic or not, whether the CO2 footprint of the farm is in spec or not? Those come from digital sensors on the ground. That data can post time date stamp on the exact moment that product is harvested and or back for the previous 30 days or 60 days if necessary. So you now have an immutable record, so that if you're a brand standing up and say, I made this brand product promise, I'm going to be antibiotic free, guess what? I have data sensors that do water table analysis and runoff analysis, and there are no antibiotics in any of those streams on the farms that I get my products from. So you have digital validation, digital inputs. Another thing that's coming are, IBM talks about crypto anchors. So imagine your cell phone with a camera that, using spectral analysis, can look at a bottle of olive oil and tell whether, compared to the baseline set, whether that olive oil is virgin olive oil or if there's been counterfeit, a blend added to save money. Spectral analysis will have a different spectral graph if there was any fraudulent additive. Imagine now taking that to E. coli or other organisms that you could see real time on a microscope equivalent and validate that your shipment is good. Imagine a DNA match. The contents of the shipment has this DNA pattern. The receipt is this. There's no fraud in between. How do you keep track of all that digital data 10 years from now? I believe in supply chain, it's going to be a blockchain world. But that's a vision. And before we go to Q&A, I just say that people ask me what lessons are learned here. One is these are all big thoughts, but the big thoughts will not monetize themselves. You have to find real small use cases and go fast, and then build those use cases into this broader vision. So with that, Don, I'll take some questions.
Great. Okay, thank you. To me, this is an amazing story. You've obviously had a success. It's around something that matters to everybody, food, and to an important company, an important industry. You're achieving important goals. The thing is rich with lessons. But I note that when you started your presentation, it was nothing about technology. You were kind of starting with a discussion of your business and how the world is changing and how these changes are leading to a new set of business problems. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, the changes in the business around preservatives, antibiotics, et cetera, is driving a lot of thought-provoking challenges in the food space. I think the other is consumers' interest in knowing. So there's really two tracks in the food and beverage industry going on today. One is the track that says, can I scan the QR code on a product and see where it came from? Carrefour, the largest retailer in Europe, you can go online and look, I think it's Blockchain Chicken, Spain, and you'll see a 30-second commercial that depicts a consumer going in, scanning the QR code on the chicken, and then seeing where it came from, ultimately what farm it came from, and the dates it was processed. I can't share the exact sales lift, but there's been a sales lift in that product, and they now have 19 other products live, and they're seeing not only the sales lift for the product, but what they're seeing is a halo effect that their private brands are getting more traction. The other track is to do with supply chain, and while food safety is important, where can you save money? Where can you improve quality? And so I think the challenge is always in business, you have to return on investment. You have to have a payback. And is it increased sales from the consumer in the first case? Or is it I'm going to do this because I'm going to get better quality or higher efficiency and therefore lower my costs?
And this is not a simple thing. I mean, you might think, well, food safety, that's not on a continuum. That's go, no go. You don't want to kill your customers. But the chances of something happening that's devastating for the business are relatively low, whereas you invest in technology and it improves efficiency and you save 1% or something, right. That's a real tangible thing. Right. So, I mean, you're part of the management group of the company. How do you value the different kind of opportunities here? Some of them being quite abstract. Transparency with a customer is going to lead to better trust, I guess, because transparency evidences trust, and it's going to create some new value for us because it evidences value like never before. It's a complicated thing. I mean, how do you sort your way through that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Any of you that are trying to sell into larger companies, one of the dynamics that the larger company itself has to deal with is there's different constituents internally. So,
that's a good point. It's not one.
It's not, the company is not monolithic. You don't have one voice of the company. Yeah. So you have food safety professionals, you have supply chain professionals, you have food quality professionals, you have new recipe people, you have people that run facilities, and you have IT departments. And a lot of times the people in IT that are interested in this are a splinter group. The core group is like, my world's okay. I don't need you to mess with it. I don't need anything new right now. Thank you very much. So part of it is finding the forward-leaning people inside your company that see a little bit of a vision and as it says here, start small, get enough proof points underway so that you can build a broader adoption and broader in interest.
All right, so that's an insight that's worth the price of admission. So it's like there's no silver bullet here. In part, it's not the actual need from the company, it's the who's in the company that has a problem that has identified a need for innovation and real solutions. And maybe it's the efficiency people or the waste people or the safety people or the whatever.
So let me give you an example. So Walmart, to their credit, said all leafy green suppliers have to be on the Food Trust platform by September 30th of 19. So Dole is a leafy green supplier to Walmart. They're now fully on the platform. But what they realized is that by going through the journey of digitizing many of their transactions in order to get efficiently on the platform, they found inefficiencies in the way they handled some of the QA processes and had extra steps, and they found ways to reduce labor. And in a good way, they redeployed the labor, they didn't lose their jobs. But that, if you hadn't gone through that process, you wouldn't have shown a light on where you can drive value. So part of what happens are the unexpected benefits that come with digitizing and putting things on blockchain. It shines a light on things that you weren't able to see before.
Now, overall, I think I mentioned in my talk, like this is a big industry, upwards of $50 trillion. And if you have it, it came from a supply chain. So everything that we have is come through a supply chain. So there are a lot of moving parts here and a lot of different players. So one of the things that, and when it comes to food, you have different things you need to measure than, say, in an electronics supply chain. So you're looking at stuff like temperature, you're looking at the provenance of the, if it was a fish, you know, it was in a fish farm, what the fish was fed, what kind of antibiotics it had, maybe who were the fish's parents, and how long has it been in the supply chain, and what temperature it was at, and how did it get handled, and so on. Where do you think this is going? How complex will this become? And from a consumer point of view, how you're going to go into a store and scan something, and it'll tell you a lot of information.
Absolutely. Well, go back to the Carrefour example for a second. Well, first of all, we were all, the advisory council was together last week in person in New York, so I got updates on how all the companies are working together. And Carrefour, one of the things they found is the consumer, the first, obviously, they had the ID, the consumer was scanning the chicken every 2 days, every time they bought the chicken. As the chicken sales stayed up, but scans went down. What happened? Wow. They trusted. Yeah. So part of this was not about transaction flow on everyday basis. It's, can this build trust in your brand? Many companies are using this to say, my private label brand has every bit as good a quality as some of the 50-year-old global brands. You should try it, and then you get that trust factor.
So big opportunity for private labels. So as I said, trust is the expectation that the other party will do the right thing, that it'll have value, and value's evidence like never before, but that it will have values. It's going to make sure that you don't get poisoned, or that fish is fresh, or that if you say it's an organic fish, it's organic. Right. So.
Yeah, there'll definitely be the consumer track, but then business is in it for business. I think you're going to find smart contracts that trigger payment. So goods are shipped, goods are received, match, trigger payment.
Yeah,
so
through a smart contract.
So you eliminate some of the overhead and therefore reduce the cost. I think that's coming too.
Yeah. So you can't just change your company, obviously. You have to change a whole industry. Now, it's helpful if you have Walmart, the big customer, or Kroger or others, saying you have to do this. And that's kind of a no-brainer business case. I don't know where that would fit in your categorization of costs and benefits. The benefit, we get to sell our stuff, as opposed to we don't get to sell it if we don't comply. This is something new about blockchain, too, is you're changing a whole industry. Could you talk about that? I mean, you're sitting there with competitors, with your best customers in this food trust. What are the conversations like? Do people let down their guard, or do you really want to get that competitor outside and hit them on the head with something?
No, it's a great question. I think we're getting cued to wrap it up, so let me try and say it succinctly. Think of food trust as the transaction layer. It's not going to have all the value-added features that will drive brand distinct value propositions. So if Walmart decides to have a consumer app, it'll be branded and be a Walmart app. I'm not saying they have plans to do that. I'm just using it as an example. If somebody wants to use the data to facilitate a certain set of value, maybe it's smart contracts for payments, not everybody is going to do the same thing with the transaction layer. But the transaction layer, by being an ecosystem, is of value because farmer A, who is growing a crop that's going to deliver to, say, a Walmart, and then the same field next field over is going to deliver and go to a quick serve restaurant, only has to participate in a blockchain system or a connected one, not a bunch of ERP systems and Excel spreadsheets, et cetera. So I think the cumulative transaction layer effect is where the value is, and then each brand will put their own spin on top of it.
And just, I'll sneak in one more question. So cynics or traditional IT types would say, well, you can do all this with a database, can't you? Well, clearly, with all the silos between ERP systems and so on, that's going to be tough. But what is the overall case for this new paradigm in technology?
Great question. Yes, I get that all the time, and I get IT departments telling me that they have a data warehouse and they can do all this. There's two challenges. One is whose data warehouse? So if I'm Nestle and I'm supplying to Walmart, is all this information in Nestle's data warehouse or Walmart's data warehouse? And how many interconnections and data handshakes are you going to do to try and keep everything in sync? So current model, it's very hard to do. Secondly, there's probably three things. Secondly, as you go past your first tier supplier to your second tier, third tier, fourth tier down to the farm, how are you going to invest your time to get all those connections made if there's not an ecosystem play to make those connections? Third, as I mentioned, the IoT signals, I do not see database technology effectively synchronizing time date stamp on all IoT inputs in 5 years. To keep all of that as an after the fact, where I'm going to post the data, I'm going to have a 3-minute delay, an hour delay, I'm going to keep it all in sync in a big data repository, that's going to be hard to do as contrasted to record it on the blockchain, use it when you need it, but it was done right there at the time.
Yeah.
So I think those are the big drivers.
A shared network.
A shared transaction platform.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'll give you one last example. So there are big things coming, and I couldn't cover it all, but a company, Sucafina, the 5th largest coffee trader in the world, has stood up a separate company called Farmer Connect. How much do you think the farmer gets out of a $3 or $4 cup of, $2, $3, $4 cup of coffee? 10 cents? 5 cents. So would you as a consumer be willing to tip the farmer 5 cents and double their income? That's the kind of thing that's coming. That was launched last month. They've got 4 or 5 major brands involved, scan a QR code, eventually tokenized so the farmer could help pay their cellular bill, et cetera. Short term, it's helping to contribute to a nonprofit in the region the farmer's in. So there's new business models coming out of this that's exciting as well.
Food sustainability. The stakes are so high here.
Yeah, well, think of it, if you go to a quick serve restaurant today, price, calories, tomorrow, price, calories, carbon footprint.
Nice.
All that's possible with blockchain.
Nice. Bob Wolpert, everyone, thank you so much.
Thank you.